Hello again everyone, welcome back to another video of the Catalan series. It's been a while since I created another video of the Catalan opening, and so I thought it'd be fun to spend a week to complete the series and just in general broaden our knowledge in openings. Now the Catalan that we're going to see today is going to be a close position Catalan, meaning that the position will look something like this, where black does not quote-unquote takes the gambit on c4 and plays pawn to c6 to maintain the structure in the center of the board. Now without further ado, let's just jump right into it. Now again, if you're not familiar with the Catalan, there's a playlist down in my description below, you can check it out. It's not a complete series, but it's slowly growing. And every time I find something new, we'll put it down on that playlist for the gain of our collective knowledge as well. And so without further ado, again, if you're not familiar, check out that playlist. But the Catalan start with pawn to d4, and after knight to f6 from black, pawn to c4, pawn to e6, g3, d5, and after bishop g2, we get into the main line of the Catalan position, with the pawn on d4 and c4, the bishop on g2, fianchettoed, and slicing towards the queen side right here. Now in the last couple of videos we talked about black wanting to play bishop to e7, castle on the king side, taking the pawn on c4 afterwards. In this particular video, because the position is close, black will want to play pawn to c6. Again, as we discussed, maintaining the structure in the center of the board. Now this kind of opening structure may not be very famous some 10-20 years ago, just because white is having an easy development in the center of the board with bishop to b2 after pawn to b3. We can play knight to f3, castle on the king side. Castle on the king side. Black on the other hand, if you think about it, has a let's good bishop that is locked behind his pawn chain. So the only way to go about it is to play pawn to b6, bishop to b7, or bishop to a6 if opportunity permits, and if possible to play pawn to e5 in the future. But obviously that's very difficult because white's just going to play knight to f3 to stop that pawn from advancing. In any case, black does not have to play pawn to c6 as his first move. He can definitely insert bishop to b4, check, and after bishop to d2 to play bishop back to e7. Promise we'll talk about this in a couple of minutes into the video, but let's see what we can do if black plays pawn to c6 to continue. Now over the years, the engine preparation always gives a slight edge after white plays knight to f3, and after bishop to e7, castle on the king side, just normal developing move. Knight to d7, pawn to b3 is always, the move that is given by the engine. The idea is to bring the bishop to b2 to control the center that way. Black will play pawn to b6. Again, there's a talk about bringing the bishop to b7 and or to a6. Knight to d2, bishop b7, and after queen to c2. Now the plan is evident for white to play pawn to e4 next move and try to break out the center of the board. And if black doesn't take, we play pawn to e5. That's kind of obvious, with the idea of gaining as much control on the center of the board. This used to be slightly worse for black, but then due to engine's development after pawn to c5, it is not that clear anymore. Suddenly, if you look at this position, and if you flip the board, black kind of has a similar structure on the queen side, arguing that it can also have a central control. And the tension on the center forces white and black to consider deeply whether or not to exchange. And say if you exchange, it will look something like this. In the end, black gains a somewhat evident counterplay on the queen side, with the knight and the bishop, and the pawn taking on d4 as well. I mean, certainly as well, we can continue with pawn to c5, but even here I think we have knight to d5 before taking the pawn on c5. Doesn't matter with the knight, the bishop, I think it's equally strong. So my point is black equalized over here pretty quickly. And if we play knight to c3 in this position, instead of knight to d2, now the engine also proposed bishop to a6. In a way, it puts a lot of pressure on the pawn on c4. Now it's attacked twice, it's defended only once with a pawn on b3. So we're already forced to actually just play something that defends the pawn, let's say with knight to d2. But then black can continue to put pressure pawn to b5. And if we have to play pawn to c5, we think we've locked up the bishop forever. But then this pawn to b4 for black is a counterplay, attacking the knight. Now, if the knight moves somewhere, let's say to a4, the bishop moves to b5 and it's still very annoying on this diagonal. It threatens to take a4, something's wrong with the bishop. And so to me, it seems like it equalizes pretty quickly as well. And so therefore in this video, I propose something that is very different from normal engine development, which is pawn to b3 and bishop to b2. In this video, I want to recommend playing knight to d2 as soon as possible. Develop like a normal person and place pawn to b6, which is again a logical move because there's nothing much that black can do aside from castling the king side and developing this minor piece on a6 or b7. We can then play queen to c2 as quickly as possible. Let's talk about trying to play pawn to e4 at the next few moves. Now if black plays bishop to a6, this move is slightly useless compared to bishop to b7. Now because our knight is not on c3, our queen on c2 protects on c4. And so we can go pawn to b3, And after the normal break on the center of the board with pawn to c5, we can pawn to e4. Black chose to play pawn takes on c4. This is too late. Pawn takes on c4, and we maintain the center of the board with this d pawn and c pawn. E pawn will be next, and this bishop will be suspicious sitting on a6 doing nothing. Can also be attacked with queen to a4 and whatnot. And so bishop to a6 in this position is bad if the knight is not developed on c3. And so as black, if you want to play this Catalan close position, you can. You want to play close attention to where you put the bishop. If knight to d2 instead of c3, you put the bishop on b7. And because the knight is not blocking the queen on c2, you do not want the bishop on a6 being very awkward, basically. And if the black pieces play pawn to c5 over here, we play pawn to e4 still. Now again, black does not want to play on c4 because we maintain the center of the board. It does not matter if black takes like this. We play pawn to e5. This is going to be devastating for black. Let's say black plays knight to g4, looking to attack the pawn on e5. We can even play pawn to h3 because after knight to e5, knight to e5, knight to e5, the rook hangs on a8. This will not be good for black. Especially in this particular move as you talk about, there's a queen to a4 check, picking up this bishop. Now that's no good for black. Now if black plays pawn to e4, and if he plays pawn takes on e4, this is slightly better continuation for black. But then after knight takes on e4, if black is not careful and trade everything on the center, we suddenly have the queen attacking the rook on a8. The rook has to move. It's hit with tempo. But the bishop stranded on a6. This is probably very bad for black. In this position, you can choose to play bishop to b7, which is bringing the bishop back to where it belongs a little bit. But this wastes time. You can just play knight to f6, bishop to f6, or knight to f6, doesn't really matter. Continue with rook to d1. In a sense, the development is easy for us playing white. It is not clear where the knight is moving next few moves. And in this position, we can claim an advantage, a slight advantage, I will say, with the pawn on the center of the board, controlling the key square like the square on d5 and b5. So in a way, it's not winning right away, but it does confer us an easy development for white. And for black, it's just going to be a bit tough if you play that way. So if we pull back a moment and we say, what if black does not play bishop to a6? What if bishop to b7 directly, just controlling the center of the board, trying to control the center of the board? Now then we play pawn to e4 rather quickly. Again, if d takes c4, knight takes on c4. It is evident why white is the more favored one in this position, with the pawn controlling the center of the board and also the knight controlling the e5 square. This knight here on c4 is also very flexible in terms of where it can go. For example, it can go to e3 to help push the pawn to d5 instead of e5. Very possible. For example, let's make a random move on pawn to b5. Just attacking the knight. Knight goes to e3 of the castle. Can prepare rook to d1 and pawn to a4. But in essence, we're trying to play pawn to d5 the next few moves. So this is very nice for white already. Now certainly black can play pawn to c5 as a pawn break to change the structure of this pawn on d4. But then as white we can play pawn to e5 as well. It does not matter if black has knight to d5. We continue to be annoying, trying to control as much space as possible in the center of the board. And in the end we also have the control on d6 square and f6 square. Now based on this view idea, white already can gain a significant amount of advantage if we can play bishop to g5. This move is slightly difficult for human to find over the board. And I agree this bishop to g5 is not natural when the bishop and the queen is lined up like this. This is more like something you have to remember. But then if you remember correctly the detail, and you play bishop to g5, the bishop cannot capture the bishop on g5 due to the fact that knight to d6 is a check. The king has to move. This is an ugly position for black to be in. White can take the bishop on b7 already. Like now we can take on b7. And if the queen has to move, let's say to c7 or c8, the bishop lost itself on g5. And have a crushing attack on the king's side. The king is very ugly, the rook's not developed. For white it actually looks crushing. He can play knight to e4 next, knight to d6. White's the one who dictates who wins this game. So black does not want to take that. Say castle on the king's side. We still take the bishop away and plant our knight on d6. I think this is already just excellent for white. We can play pawn to a3 to stop knight to b4. We can play queen to e2. In essence, white is not out of plans and will be the one who is pushing for win. We pull back a bit. Now in this position we can play pawn takes on e4 instead of pawn takes on c4. And if that happens, we take on e4 with the knight. And if black tries with the move pawn to c5 again, we take on f6 and we take on c5. Now in a sense we open up the line for the rook to come in and attack the queen. Also, if bishop takes on c5, we have the trap of pawn to b4. This is nice because as the bishop takes on b4, we can play queen to a4. Again, we see the recurring pattern with the queen coming to a4 because the king is not castled, attacking the bishop here on b4. Early on, it's attacking the bishop on a6. And so this is a dangerous territory already for black if he does not play correctly. The correct move here to continue is pawn takes on c5, but this is very ugly. And I suppose and expect that white is already a lot better and can drive that win back home. And if he does play bishop takes on f6, we can play pawn to d5. We tear open the king's side, the center of the board. If he plays pawn takes on d5, rook to e1 comes with check. He's forced to play bishop to e7, but then after bishop to g5, he has to play pawn to f6 in order for him to castle on the king's side. Obviously this is very ugly. After bishop to f4 as well, castle. We can take the pawn and really tear up the center of the board. Bishop to d5 does not matter, we can play rook a d1. We sacrifice a pawn, but we bring our rook to the open file. We can attack some of the weakest minor pieces on the board right here. To show you one line, white can already play aggressively queen to c4, say after rook to f7 to block the check. You can already play knight to g5 attacking this rook. Black is forced to take, then after bishop takes on c6, we're just demonstrating how strong the rook is on the open file, being helped by the bishop on the open diagonal. So I won't go too much into the line, but definitely this is bad for black if he does play this kind of line. So more often than not, the best chance for black to continue in this Catalan position is to castle on the king's side, just to save the king from future trouble before developing his piece on either b7 or a6, and to look for the push of pawn to c5. Now that's why we do the same thing. We want to play pawn to e4 just because we prepared this for so long. It's just odd if we don't play this. Again, dc4 can happen, but as you can see with the series of moves, even if the move all they are the same, again the king is castled. It's very difficult for the king to be trapped in the center of the board, and with the knight d6 that we talked about earlier. And so either way, it'll be a pretty much balanced game. But still, it's not like in this position white does not have a slight advantage due to, the imposing pieces on the center of the board. And the fact that black's just trying to respond to every move that white made can be seriously frustrating for the second player. And so in a way, I think that this position is an opening success. Just to give a sample of line, black can play knight to c5, but then queen to d4. We're holding the pawn together with the help of the knight on d6. If black takes that away, we attack the rook. A rook to e8 will have guaranteed that white plays pawn to e5. Now we cement the bishop on d6. There's no end to white controlling the center of the board, while black just tries to defend, trying to respond to what white does in the first couple of moves. Or shall I say in the first 20 moves or 22 moves. So again, as I'll emphasize, an opening success. Probably an engine will be able to defend, but as a human I think that will be very difficult for us to continue. If you guys still watching, I know I promised about discussing the bishop b4 check, but then I already spent about 10 to 12 minutes discussing these lines, and I just don't want to go any more longer. And so I'm calling it a day, due to health and safety reason. So expect a part 2 that talks about the bishop b4 line, also some of the review games and statistics on this opening. So that's it for today. Do drop a like if you think that this video is helpful. Otherwise, I'll see you very soon. Thanks for watching.